He became the most powerful man on earth at age 6. He reigned for over 90 years and outlived every person who was supposed to succeed him. When he finally died, the entire civilization he had inherited collapsed within decades. He did not lose a war, and he was not overthrown by a rival. He simply lived too long, and that was enough to destroy everything. This is the story of Pepi II, the last pharaoh of Egypt's golden age, and the man whose existence brought it to an end. The year is approximately 2278 BC, and the Old Kingdom of Egypt stands at the absolute peak of its perceived power. This is the era of the Great Pyramid builders, a civilization so mathematically and architecturally advanced that the rest of the ancient world has no comparable reference point. For 500 years, this golden age has been held together by a rigid system of order, ritual, and the absolute authority of the pharaoh. To the people outside the palace walls, Egypt looks eternal, a place where temples, rituals, and harmony hold the universe together without interruption. But this glittering facade is hiding something that nobody inside the palace is allowed to say out loud. The Old Kingdom's decline did not begin with Pepi II. It began a century before he was born. For generations, his predecessors had poured the empire's vast wealth into constructing massive pyramids, each one more ambitious than the last. These monumental tombs required millions of stone blocks, tens of thousands of laborers, and an extraordinary logistical network to feed and house them all. By the time Pepi II's dynasty arrived, the sheer cost of pyramid building had severely weakened Egypt's treasury. The central government was financially overstretched, bleeding grain and resources just to maintain the glorious illusion of divine power. The empire looked invincible from the outside, but its foundations had been hollowed out by the ego of dead kings. It is into this fragile, financially strained empire that Pepi II is born. Inside the royal palace, the atmosphere is anything but harmonious. The palace is packed not with love, but with siblings, half-brothers, concubines, and secondary wives, every one of them a possibility and a lethal threat at the same time. In the Egyptian court, succession anxiety is not a future problem. It is baked directly into the walls. When the previous pharaoh dies, the palace immediately scrambles to fill the void, because everyone knows that an empty throne is an open invitation to blood. And so, at the age of 6, Pepi II is placed at the center of all of it. Brutal reality. 1. The empire was already cracking before he arrived. He was not just the man who destroyed the Old Kingdom. He was the last man standing in a building that had been structurally compromised for a century before he arrived. The nomarchs, the provincial governors who would eventually dismantle his empire, were able to accumulate power partly because the central government was already too financially exhausted to stop them. Pepi II inherited an institution that was bleeding from wounds inflicted by his own predecessors, and he had neither the awareness nor the tools to close them. Every pyramid built before his birth had cost the Old Kingdom a piece of the authority he was supposed to inherit. He arrived at the throne of the most powerful empire on earth, and found that a significant portion of that power had already been quietly redistributed to the men who were supposed to serve him. Brutal reality 2. He became pharaoh at age 6, and his reign was weakened from the first day. A 6-year-old cannot run an empire. A 6-year-old cannot command armies, manage grain stores, or hold provincial governors accountable for taxes they have decided to keep for themselves. Priests pour cold Nile water over his small body and anoint him heavily with myrrh and frankincense, sacred oils meant to seal the gap between his fragile human flesh and his new absolute divinity. The heavy double crown of Egypt is lowered onto his tiny head. A crook is placed in one hand and a flail in the other. And at 6 years old, he is officially declared the living embodiment of the god Horus on earth. His mother steps in immediately to rule as regent alongside a council of elite nobles and provincial governors called nomarchs. For years, the young pharaoh is kept occupied with the exhausting performance of divinity. His days are filled with ritual cleansing at dawn and endless temple processions, dressed, undressed, purified, and dressed again, while the scent of incense follows him everywhere he goes. His tutors teach him how to stand before priests, how to be carried in public, and how to project absolute divine perfection in every visible moment. He is told that the entire world functions only because he exists. He is taught that when the Nile floods on schedule, it is because he pleased the gods, and when it fails to flood, the failure is entirely his. But while Pepi is performing the rituals of godhood, the nomarchs in the outer provinces are doing something far more consequential. They are keeping more of the tax grain for themselves instead of sending it to the capital. They are building their own private armies funded by the wealth they are no longer forwarding to the crown. They are passing their governorships to their own sons, bypassing the royal appointment system that was designed to keep them dependent on pharaonic approval. By the time Pepi II is old enough to rule without a regent, the damage is already irreversible. The nobles are too powerful, too entrenched, and too wealthy to be brought back under control by a young man who spent his entire childhood being dressed as a god, rather than trained as a ruler. Brutal reality 3. He was running an empire and he was worried about flies. As Pepi II grows into adulthood and takes full control of the throne, he does not attempt to rein in his increasingly autonomous provincial governors. Instead, he leans further into the performance of divinity and develops an intense personal preoccupation with houseflies. Egypt is hot, and the Nile brings insects alongside the life-giving floodwater. For a normal person, this is an irritation. For a living god who cannot be seen swatting at his own face during a sacred ceremony, it is an unacceptable insult to the entire cosmological order he is supposed to represent. So Pepi II arrives at a solution that captures everything important about the kind of ruler he is. He orders his palace slaves stripped completely naked and covered from head to toe in thick, sticky honey, then positioned strategically around his rooms and courtyards at all times. The flies, drawn by the overwhelming scent of the sugar, bypass the pharaoh entirely and swarm the slaves instead. Picture the throne room of the most advanced civilization on Earth. Breathtaking architecture, blinding gold, the vizier arriving with tax records while nomarchs wait for the pharaoh's judgment on regional disputes that are quietly deciding the fate of the empire. And standing directly beside the supreme ruler of all of this is a naked human being. Motionless, covered from head to foot in hundreds of crawling, biting insects, forbidden to move or make a sound while the flies drink from his skin. This is the man running Egypt, while his nobles dismantled it from the outside. A ruler so completely insulated by manufactured divinity that he weaponized human suffering to solve a problem any peasant in his kingdom handled with a piece of cloth. The real pests consuming his empire were the nomarchs quietly carving it into private territories. Pepi II had solved the fly problem and called it governance. Brutal reality 4. He lived so long he outlived the empire itself. The decades accumulate and Pepi II continues to reign. He celebrates his said festival at the 30-year mark, a massive ritual meant to renew the pharaoh's physical and divine strength. He wears the double crown, runs a sacred course between boundary markers, and the priests chant the prayers designed to reset his aging body. Then he rules for another decade and then another 20 years beyond that. Historical records place his reign at somewhere between 64 and 94 years on the throne. He is quite possibly the longest reigning monarch in all of recorded human history. For the first few decades, this seems like evidence of divine favor. By the final decades, it has become a catastrophe with no available solution. In a monarchy, stability depends entirely on a clear and undisputed line of succession. Pepi II lives so far beyond any reasonable expectation that he begins to outlive every person in that line. His sons grow old waiting for the baton and die before he passes it. His grandsons are born, reach middle age, and die while he is still on the throne wearing the double crown. The royal family tree becomes a tangled competing mass of great-grandsons and ambitious lesser wives, every one of them with a claim, and none with the authority to press it while the old man is still breathing. By his 80s and 90s, the pharaoh on the throne is increasingly a ghost in his own palace. His limbs tremble and his breath shortens, and the sacred oils and prayers can no longer mask the steep physical collapse that the court maintains a strict fiction of ignoring. He is too weak to lead armies and too frail to enforce decrees, and the provincial nobles have been watching this deterioration for years. They stop pretending to answer to the crown and declare themselves independent rulers of their own territories. They build armies funded by the grain they stopped sending to the capital decades ago. When Pepi II finally dies in his 90s, he leaves behind not a succession but an apocalypse. With no clear heir and dozens of competing claims, the royal court implodes immediately. A climate shift delivers years of catastrophically low Nile floods, destroying harvests across the country at the exact moment the central government has ceased to function. The independent nomarchs launch massive territorial wars against each other. Within decades of his death, the Old Kingdom, the 500-year civilization that built the pyramids and held together the most advanced society in the ancient world, collapses completely. Egypt fractures into warring states with no functioning central authority. Trade routes collapse and famine spreads across the country. Ancient texts from this period describe communities resorting to eating the dead in order to survive the winters that follow the failed harvests. This era becomes known as the First Intermediate Period, a dark age of violence, chaos, and suffering that left a permanent mark on Egyptian culture for centuries afterward. Historians draw a direct line from this collapse to Pepi II, his childhood regency that allowed the nobles to become untouchable. His reign so long it destroyed the succession that might have stabilized the transition and the financial exhaustion his predecessors left him as an inheritance. Pepi II had everything the ancient world could offer a single human being. He had absolute power over the most advanced civilization on Earth, the worship of millions, and the resources of an empire that had stood unbroken for 5 centuries. He also had honey-covered slaves standing beside him at all times, which tells you something precise about how he chose to use all of it. He did not lose Egypt in battle, in a coup, or to a foreign invasion. He lost it by living too long, governing too weakly, and spending his enormous power on the performance of godhood, rather than the actual work of ruling. The pyramids his predecessors built are still standing. The empire he inherited and held for 90 years was gone within a single generation of his death. He was the most powerful man in the world for longer than most people live. He used that time to make himself untouchable by flies.